Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first of our BPCG at Home series of online talks, Women on Nature and Wildlife. This will be the first of a series of talks that we've got going on over, over the winter and into the spring. And for the first of that talks, I am delighted to welcome Emily Millhouse of Froglife. Froglife is a national wildlife charity committed to the conservation of amphibians and reptiles and saving the habitats that they depend on. Emily's got a presentation that she's going to show us, so I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to stop talking now and just pass straight over to her. Emily, if you want to share your screen, and we'll get the ball rolling. Thank you very much.
No, perfect. Thank you for that, Joshua. So let me just open this up. So for anyone that might have a whole list of faces on the right hand side, don't worry too much if you just move my head essentially over the Froglife logo. That will stay the same the whole talk, so it won't be in the way of anything there. So firstly, thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm glad that we've put on a good show against, Great British Bake Off's final in a little bit of time. So I'm glad that we've won on that. Toads are through. So I'm going to have a brief chat a bit about, well, what and who Froglife are and the work that we do. There's going to be a big focus on the work that we do within London. Some of you actually may have seen some of us at events, so there's a few of us in our team. We've spent quite a lot of time in Lambeth the past 2 years, so it's very possible you might have seen one of our boards or something else around. So to kick us off, I'll begin with just introducing you who Froglife are, although Joshua did beat me to the bullet there and exactly what we are. So we are a national wildlife conservation charity. So we're primarily focused on our amphibians and reptiles, and that's all the sort of habitats that they may be depending on. So obviously the most obvious one of that is ponds. So we have lovely ponds like that within the community greenhouses, through to sort of very large ponds that you might find in bigger parks. So elsewhere in Lambeth, you may find sort of Ruskin Park that have the sort of old Victorian ponds. So working on ponds like that, all the way through to looking at the kind of terrestrial or land habitat that our animals need. So thinking a little bit about where they're spending basically this time of year, really. So most of our amphibians aren't in the ponds right now. Most of them are outside of the ponds under logs and hiding. So lots of work goes into creating high vernacular and log piles and things like that, with many other fancy names for quite simple tasks that you can easily do in your own green spaces or gardens. So as I mentioned, we are the Trust is a charity. And we have three main areas to our work. So the first one is transforming landscapes, and that is sort of the mass of our habitat work. So that is working all across the UK, as I sort of mentioned before, so building ponds and doing works within sort of parks or with sort of councils, and just improving areas for amphibians or reptiles. The second area of our work is transforming lives, and that pretty much falls under what we're doing right now. So we're talking to as many different people as possible, working very strong on the education side of things. Unfortunately, not everyone thinks our amphibians and reptiles are cute animals, and they much prefer to learn about or tend to know a little bit more about our sort of cute, fluffy animals or animals with whiskers, like hedgehogs. So we're trying to do a lot of work around that and getting people aware that amphibians are really important within and reptiles within sort of the ecosystem itself. And the third area of our work is looking into research. So we've got quite a lot of different sort of research partners internationally. So we work a lot on amphibian and reptile disease. So I won't go too much into disease at all in this talk. It's pretty much a talk of its own. But we look a lot at sort of population trends of the species that we do have and how they're faring. So some of the animals that I'll mention in a slide or two's time aren't doing too well in the UK, and it's just sort of us getting a real good idea of where they are and how we can be helping them. I'll also link a slide a little bit later on to one sort of really recent area of research that we've been working on the past sort of 10 years or so, and it's ongoing, is into wildlife tunnels and how they're a good option for mitigation of stopping basically road deaths for our amphibians and reptiles, and pretty much many other types of animals actually that just cannot get across these man-made roads that we're putting that sort of cut habitats up. So that in the core is what Froglife do. We do have a trading arm, Froglife Ecological Services. This is where anyone can get in touch with us, whether it's for garden pond works or sort of councils that are looking for very large scale works or developers. And that's where we do most of our sort of surveying works or big habitat works that are private. Mitigation, so that might be working with some of our protected species, like sand lizards or great crested newts, working on how best to move them around a site. And the big one on that side is training. So again, teaching people how and what great crested newts are. They're sort of the licensing that you do need for them, and also how to look after your habitats actually in those kind of spaces. So, of course, no talk from Froglife would be complete without looking at our native species. This talk will mainly be about our projects that we have going on and how you can get involved, but we will, of course, look at our 7 native amphibians to begin with. So at the top here, we have our anurans, or our frogs and toads that are native to the UK. So the common frog on the top left is the one you most likely spot, particularly in spring. You'll see many of their little heads popping up on the surface of the water amongst masses of frog spawn. They also may be the animals that you're disturbing right now. So if you're doing anything sort of winter garden works or working on any community gardens or spaces, they may be the ones that you're disturbing a little bit more, and you'll see them sort of leap and move out of the way. We've got the common toad in the middle. If any of you read my job title, you'll find that I'm very biased towards the toad. My whole project in London is focused around helping those adorable, handsome little guys there in the middle. So toads aren't doing too great, and a lot of the work that we are doing at the moment is just basically educating people about how toads and frogs are different and what they do need. To the right hand side, the natterjack toad. This is another one of our native amphibian species. It isn't one I would expect to find in London at all. So by all means, I wouldn't expect you to pop out to Brockwell Park or anywhere like that and find an natterjack toad. But if you are going on holiday, particularly towards places like the southwest, so towards Devon or Cornwall, or maybe heading into Wales, you're more likely to come across natterjack toad populations. Another one of our adorable animals. So then if we have to take a little look at our salamanders or newt species, we have our 3 main guys here. All 3 of these are present in London's ponds. So you find the smooth newt on the far left. This is the most common of all of our newt species, and is the newt that I know we spotted quite a lot of, was it last summer at the community greenhouses. So there's plenty of these within the pond. To the middle, the palmate newt. We do find these in ponds across London. They're just not as commonplace. They actually prefer slightly more acidic sort of water, so you tend not to find them in as many of London's ponds, as ours don't tend to fall into that kind of pH scale. And then there's the big guy, the dragon of the ponds, the great crested newt. So for any of you that may have spotted newts around but haven't ever seen a great crested newt, you would know if you spotted one. If you look down to any adults, particularly any kids here, if you look down at an adult's hand and look from basically where their middle finger is to the base of their hand, that's about the same size as what a great crested newt is. So it's significantly larger than the smooth and palmate newts. It's also got that wonderful crest and that white flash of its tail. It's very special if you're lucky enough to find great crested newts in and around your ponds, and they are there within London. I wasn't wrong in saying there's 7. The pool frog gets its own slide animation for a very specific reason. Is unfortunately the Victorians had a habit of bringing quite a lot of non-native species of frogs, particularly to the UK, where they wanted to collect them, and lots of those were released into gardens. And one of those frogs that was constantly released is called the marsh frog. There's quite a lot of marsh frogs left in London, and they are non-native and they are very large. So a marsh frog, probably on average, is about the same size as my head, which of course, if you put that into a pond with any of these other species, they do tend to struggle. But the one that struggled the most was the pool frog. And the Victorian sort of addition of all these non-native frogs into the UK, particularly around the southeast, actually led to the pool frog going extinct in the UK in around sort of the 1930s. It does get to feature though, because it is native, and it has been reintroduced. So if you travel to Norfolk, particularly the northern parts of the Norfolk Broads, you will find pool frog populations there. It's actually going quite successfully. They are starting to expand again naturally into the sort of ecological niches or ponds and places that they do like once again. So yeah, another one to, if you have a list at home of species you want to spot, pool frog can be almost like a grail species to go and find. Fantastic little animals. So the other half of Froglife is looking at our reptile species. So the top three here we're looking at are our lizards. So we have the viviparous lizard, or more commonly known as the common lizard. We have the slow worm in the middle and the sand lizard on the right. So the common lizard and the slow worm, which is top middle and top left, are the two species you're likely to find within London. People always seem fascinated to know that we do have lizards, one in the UK and two even in cities like ours. And South East London's actually quite a good stronghold for common lizards. So it is very likely, if you sort of head out of Lambeth, head in towards sort of Southwark or Lewisham, you start to head to places that do have more populations of common lizards, and they're fantastic to spot. Another actual really good place in case you get really inspired to look at our reptiles a bit more. If you head to the London Wetland Centre, over sort of summertime, you'll see loads of common lizards there, all sort of basking along their boardwalk. So fantastic thing to be able to spot. Slow worms, also known as the gardener's best friend. These are the ideal thing for anyone that wants to grow any animals, any sort of fruit or veg, because it will consume all of those pest animals that you don't want there. They eat the highest quantity of slugs and snails going, and they're more than happily will live their entire life in a compost bin. It's got everything they would want there. So they can breed within there, they can overwinter in there, they can feed within that space. Yeah, they're quite a special animal to be able to spot. And there's plenty of them within sort of London's allotment sites or small community gardens. The sand lizard, its name gives it away a little bit there. Sand lizards you don't tend to find within London. You do find them sort of across sand dunes. Again, the southwest is quite a stronghold for this, but they do come across into places like Surrey, so again not too far away from us. You will find them out in the wild. This photo of a sand lizard here is a very pronounced male, hence why he's so green. You'll actually tend to find they're not quite as green as that. They tend to be a little bit more muted in their coloration, but another good one to be able to spot. And then we'll have a little look at our snakes. So another one of the things people don't think about when they think the UK, they don't really think much about us having snakes here, but we have three different species. We have the grass snake in the bottom left, the adder in the middle, and the smooth snake on the right hand side. So the grass snake is the most sort of numerous that we do have, sort of across all of the UK really, and particularly in London. Quite a lot of good populations of grass snakes within London. Quite commonly, you'll find them near sort of quite large bodies of water, including rivers, so along sort of the Lee Valley and the River Lee, you'll find them in many ponds in that kind of area, because they are a snake that it loves to swim, and it does most of its what do we say, eating, we'll call it, most of its eating of all of the 7 amphibians I just spoke about. It will happily consume most of those on a good day. Adders is the UK's one venomous snake that we do have. Its venom's nothing at all for you to be worried about. It's incredibly sort of scarcely sort of populated around the place. In London, we have a few small populations of them. They're incredibly secretive. It's always the snake that I find if you have very excited children or a dog or anything like that that's likely to have any form of pitter-patter of feet. It's long gone and hidden, the adder. It's staying well away, because there's many other things that do eat it. Its venom is mainly catering towards sort of small mice and other things it would find in fields. And then we have the very rare smooth snake. So there are smooth snakes about. Again, we're heading sort of towards south, a little bit into the southwest. So sort of Surrey and Hampshire is where you're finding some populations of smooth snakes. All the way up to in Scotland, there's some areas of populations there. Yeah, not one of the snakes I'd expect to find within London at all, which also follows into this native reptile, for sure, the world's largest turtle. I would not expect to be swimming up the Thames. Something would be seriously wrong with it if it was doing so. But you do commonly find in summer leatherback turtle sightings all across the coast of Wales and all across sort of the south coast as it comes here to feed. Again, quite a fascinating thing to go out and see. They're about 2 meters in size and sort of length, so they're very sizable to be able to spot. So in a nutshell, these are all the animals that our charity basically aims on conserving and educating people about. So we'll have a little talk about, I suppose, how we're doing that. So we have a whole variety of projects. I always worry that someone from Froglife is also in a talk like this and I've missed out their project, but hopefully not. We have the London Tales of Amphibian Discovery, or T.O.A.D project. That's the project that I manage within London. And we have our team, and we'll talk more about that in depth later. We also have our very new project in London called Leaping Forward for Dementia. So Froglife does quite a lot of work with those living with dementia across the UK. The newest sort of iteration or version of that is Leaping Forward, and that is actually going to be primarily taking place within Lambeth. So my colleague Vicky is the one spearheading that. And no doubt you'll start to see her name and her face across the borough as she starts to set up groups and doing outdoor activities with them. This dementia work is also elsewhere. So we do this kind of work within Glasgow and within Somerset, which is where we've sort of proven that it does work and it is really effective to be out there and working in green spaces with people that are older within our communities. At the other end of that spectrum, Green Pathways is working with sort of young people and those from disadvantaged backgrounds, maybe those that aren't doing so well in mainstream education and can really benefit from actually doing more hands-on practical skills. So again, within Glasgow, within Peterborough and within Sussex, we're working with schools and groups there, getting them out onto either our nature reserves or in their local green spaces and doing quite a lot of habitat work whilst working on sort of improving social skills and communication with each other. So it's a fantastic project that's been running for quite a long time, and it's been sort of all across the UK in its sort of little project pods and areas. Another one of our big projects, about the same kind of size as London T.O.A.D, is Come Forth for Wildlife. So this is one of our sort of big Scottish projects, and this works across the Forth Valley region, working a lot on habitat connectivity and quite a lot of public engagement in getting people, again, just thinking about their native amphibians and reptiles and what they could be doing in their own personal gardens or even within school grounds to help these animals here. Discovering Reptiles is another actually quite new project for us. This sort of started right at the beginning of lockdown this year. And this is a national project just trying to promote reptiles within the UK. So trying to get rid of some of the stigmas that hold on to snakes and lizards and get people thinking a bit more about how special they are and how fantastic it is that we actually have them here in the UK and what you can be doing to help them. So there's quite a lot of work going on sort of all across the UK in talks and training about helping reptiles. Living Waters, its name there sort of shows pretty much that it leans very heavily to the habitat side of the kind of works that we do. So this works on creating habitat corridors across the UK. So the most recent version of this was in Sheffield. So a network of, I believe the last count was 31 ponds across Sheffield, linking up a variety of different green spaces and almost creating a sort of a highway for amphibians and other species to actually use those spaces. I know for a while we talk a lot about green space, but it's sort of still quite new linguistically to think about blue space, and that ponds are really still needed. Often the big fix for sort of carbon emissions or climate change tends to be planting trees, but there's still a lot of value in creating ponds, and we need sort of all variety of habitats for things really to survive. And that's something that Living Waters is really pushing towards doing. Now, going on to probably Froglife's largest or most well-known of all of our projects, which is T.O.A.Ds on Roads. T.O.A.Ds on Roads is sort of a cohort of volunteer patrol groups that we have across the UK that go out in springtime when toads are migrating and help them get across roads without being squashed by cars. It's an incredible effort. It's been running now for nearly 40 years, this project. At the moment, we have about 210 volunteer patrol groups that go out in springtime and do this movement. And this is the stats from 2019. We're still getting some stats come through for 2020, but it's about 107,000 toads that have been collected. Oh, I realise I've got a typo in there. Whoops. Yes, about 107,000 toads that were collected off of the roads, counted up and sort of been looked at last year and moved across the road as they head towards their breeding ponds. The quantity of those that unfortunately got squashed on the roads is sitting at about 13,500 toads, and this is just on the managed roads. I mean, there's plenty more mortality that does occur across the UK, and sort of the best statistic that we're sort of aware of, working with both our Toads on Roads patrol groups and various councils that monitor this for us, it's about 20 tonnes of dead toads each year that are pulled off of British roads. So it's a bit of a problem, and it's an ongoing problem that as toads migrate, they're really struggling to get through sort of developments or roads that we're putting in without any true gaps for them to be able to get past. I'm trying to think where all of you may be living in and around Lambeth. A really good place to spot or get involved in a local patrol group is actually sort of just going the other way, so heading a bit more west. If you head towards Ham Common or Ham Common Woods within Richmond, there's a road there called Church Lane, has about 3,000 migrating toads each year that cross over from the woods area to the actual common where the ponds are. And the council there actually do a great job in that for a month they actually close that lane just to allow safe passageway of those toads, to let them all get across, and then they reopen the road back to sort of traffic for the rest of the year. But it makes an incredible effort on actually sustaining that population of toads there. So yeah, but certainly a thing to go see. People don't think about mass migration of amphibians, and particularly not in cities like ours that are so developed and urbanised. So yeah, there's one thing you take from this is next February, get yourself to Ham Common and have a look at all these toads moving. So in sort of response to that, I mentioned that our research, we've done a lot of work into monitoring those toad populations. So we're very lucky with all of those volunteer groups that for 40 years or so, they have been collecting data on the amount of toads they're moving each year and how that sort of balances between male and females and sort of the rough ages of those individuals. From that, we have launched our wildlife tunnel campaign, and this is where we're lobbying highways agencies and the Department for Transport that if roads are being built, particularly on these migration routes, it's incredibly simple when you're building a road to leave tunnels like this one pictured within these developments to allow animals to have safe passageway. They work the exact same way for hedgehogs and for our reptile species, and will do a world of good to help out. And it's something that's been proven, has been working very well across the rest of Europe. It's just in the UK, we're a little bit behind in creating mitigation like this for our land animals. So by all means, if all of you have got about 15 seconds to spare at the end of this talk, please do go on change.org and add your name to our campaign as we push back to say something needs to be done. So jumping a bit closer to home, we'll have a little talk a bit more about the London projects that are running. So the first of those is the new project. So this is the Leaping Forward for Dementia project. So it's very hands-on. It's going to be working with those people living with dementia, not only sort of improving habitats or spaces, but also working with them and seeing sort of basically how we can improve our knowledge. I always find, particularly in cities, you'll find people that have lived there for a very long time are very aware of maybe a time when there was an abundance of certain wildlife and what it used to be like to now basically how that's changed over time. And it's basically working with that as a group and improving green spaces whilst getting people out of spaces like care homes or less isolated from being stuck at home. It's a fantastic thing. It's coming off the back of the other two projects. And there's plenty of reports if you're particularly interested in this kind of, they call it sort of green therapy per se. There was two recent sort of reports from Natural England, Greening Dementia and Is It Nice Outside, that looked into this, and essentially they just pulled out all of the benefits that there is to actually being outdoors and engaging with green space. I think all of us feel it. Sometimes the thing we really want to do to clear our head is to step into a park or into a community garden, and it really does help. And you'll see a lot more coming from this project here. as time goes on. We do that through a variety of different activities. So everything from our very Froglife heavy activities like this here, which you can see on the left, which this was working in care homes in Glasgow, where lots of small ponds were built. Again, just showing that kind of, yeah, getting outdoors, getting hands-on, getting involved with it, but also improving the space for our native amphibians. And I always find you'll find people spend a lot of time, or have a lot of appreciation to sit by a pond, particularly in summer when it's sort of buzzing alive with life, things like dragonflies or damselflies flying around. It can be a really nice place to just rest and listen and take in sort of what's going on in the natural world. All the way through to the projects just on the right hand side, we've got an individual who's on one of Zach, who's one of my colleagues who runs Somerset's Green Pathways for Life. And they do lots of sort of outdoor, whether it be woodworking or surveying for certain plant species that they do have, or pruning and working within their local sort of churchyards and community gardens they have nearby. Yeah, so there's lots of this coming, and it's something for sure. If you're involved in any green spaces or any community gardens within Lambeth, you can get in touch with me or my colleague Vicky, and we can certainly explore what's going to be happening over the next 5 years within London. We're now going to move on to the very biased bit of the talk, which is my project, the London T.O.A.D project. So the London T.O.A.D project is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So if any of you here listening are play the lottery at all, thank you very much. You support the kind of work that we're able to do, and you're supporting me being here this evening to be able to speak to you all. And yeah, it's heavy focus on our very handsome common toads, which you can see here, and in a whole variety of weird and wonderful ways. If you haven't heard of our project before, you're probably going to see now that it's a bit out there for some of the things that we do. So in 2016, one of the sort of research papers that we released was looking at the decline of the UK's common toad. And it's a real horrible statistic here in the amount that we have lost. So we have lost 68% of our common toads over the past 30 years or so in the UK. And most of those declines have been here in the southeast of England, and particularly cities like London. So this project is basically in response to that, is getting people thinking about the toads, what we can do to help them, and basically educating on why this is happening. So I spoke earlier about toads on roads, and a lot of that is due to the mortality. This sort of decline is due to mortality on roads as they're heading back to their breeding ponds, but also due to the removal of ponds. People often don't necessarily do an audit for the amount of ponds that we have in the UK year on year. But in the past 50 years, the look that we've had across many different maps is we've lost about 2/3 of all of the ponds that we have in the UK in the past 50 years. And of course, for the amphibians that we have that rely on those places to breed, is only going to lead to declines like this from happening. So I'm gonna let you take a step into what I'm doing on my day-to-day in trying to get people thinking about toads. So our project so far has been running for 2 years. In 2 years, we've been quite busy. So we cover everything essentially within the M25. Although I would say Lambeth very solidly is London. When you start to head out to places like Hillingdon, it certainly doesn't feel like you're in London anymore. Very different kind of spaces to be talking about or engaging with. But we've run about 220 events across London in all of these kind of boroughs, and a wide variety of different styles of events. So we really flick between getting people outdoors, getting people muddy, building ponds or doing planting, all the way through to doing more textile work. So maybe engaging a bit more with materials, or maybe even engaging with technology to think a little bit about toads, just to try and encompass as many different types of London as that we do have. Of course, everyone that works or lives in London all have different opinions on where they live and different interests. So we've tried to tap into as much of that as possible. A really lovely sort of statistic that we do have from our project is that we've engaged with, it's about 21,000 people directly. so far on our project. Unfortunately, it would have been a bit higher, but COVID got in the way of our summer plans for sure, and getting outdoors and speaking with people at events. But we will be continuing that for at least the next year, trying to get out there and talk to as many people as possible about toads and ways they can help them. So one of the big areas of that is habitat works, of course. We'll tackle their habitats as is. So from sort of the information we have from where populations of toads are across basically across the UK, but for our project specifically within London. So we identified what began as 7 sites. Whenever I seem to blink, we seem to add more habitat sites to our project. I seem to be visiting all different boroughs all at different time, thinking about ponds, which is great. But we started off with 7 sites that were identified as having common toad populations, but either those populations had quite poor habitat or habitat that was in need of repair or restoration, or places that we needed to create more habitat for. And this could even be not necessarily always ponds. It can also be creating overwintering spaces very close to ponds, as amphibians, particularly toads, don't necessarily have to migrate long distances if they've got everything they need all year round in close proximity to the pond. So if we can keep them in a very sort of secure, nice green park with plenty of insects and things for them to eat, then they're less likely they're going to stray out across the roads and get squashed in those kind of places. So just for a bit of context of the kind of places that you're looking at in some of our pictures here. So the top left here is a pond that we restored called Pine Pond in Lesners Abbey in Bexley. It's quite a large pond, that. And this had quite a heavy amount of work. It'd been completely choked up by vegetation. So yeah, I should have got a nicer, greener photo of it now, because it's now a year and a half old, that pond. So yeah, lots of things thriving there. That was a real success for our project, because almost instantly, I think it was 19 days after the works had finished there, toads were spotted mating in that pond. So if you ever want to tick a box, particularly to a funder to say it works, that was a great thing for us to spot. The pond on the bottom here might be a pond that you're familiar with. So this is Oval Pond within Ruskin Park. So this is one of these old Victorian ponds. So last year, a lot of vegetation was cleared from this pond just to try and open it up. It is a pond that has a few ongoing issues, but those weren't able to be seen until we cleared the whole space. So this is sort of the large pond within Ruskin Park, but actually from where this photo is taken, if you walk directly down towards the Friends of sort of little hut or cabin there, there's a fantastic little wildlife garden with a network of 3 ponds within there, where you'll see plenty of amphibians, particularly across spring and summer next year. So a great place to be able to visit. And on the right is just a wonderful photo of someone from the Friends of Ruskin Park that had joined us and got quite muddy, shifting a lot of the mud from that pond there into habitat piles. After every single big pond work has been done, the key things that we try our best to do is we work a lot with the local community. So whether that be volunteers that work on the site, could be friends of groups, it could even be the actual sort of rangers for those parks or spaces. We go in and teach 3 main things to those people. So we'll teach the amphibian and reptile identification. We'll then follow that up with teaching people how to survey for those animals, so they can get a real good idea and real good sort of bunches of data to show how their species are doing on their site. And then the third bit is looking into actual habitat restoration or habitat management. So how are they going to keep that pond looking like a nice healthy pond for time to come, as every single pond, its dream in life is to become a woodland, as is succession. So everything just wants to constantly grow bigger and better, but we do have to keep pond-based habitats, so we do have to keep certain vegetation at bay. So after this point, once we've finished all of our training program, we hand that space or those ponds back over to the local community, and we return on 1, 3, 5, 7 and 10 years after we've made a pond to help out and retrain if needed on the sites, and just be there for support for any of the ponds that we have built as people change, as their commitments change. Another side of that, which actually ties in very well to Brockwell Park, is our nature trails. So for London T.O.A.Ds project, we have 10 sites we've worked on that are our nature trail sites. So we have 5 within Ealing and 5 within Lambeth. And these are sites that have been identified by the council, where they'd like to basically guide people from one park to another park in completely different areas of the borough, and get them to really explore the green space that is immediately where they live. So in Ealing, it's actually quite a good example in Ealing, because we go from Walpole Park, which is an old manor house with a moat, and just lots of open grassland where people picnic, and not very wild, but all the way out as you head even further west towards almost Heathrow Airport, you get to a place called Horsenden Hill, which truly is wild, and it's really getting people to think about where else can they go to spend their time. So on those nature trails, we do quite a lot of volunteering. So even tomorrow, actually, I'll be out in Ealing doing this kind of work here. In many of these photos, nothing looks like it's ponds, but it looks like they're ponds. But I can assure you, in all the photos, apart from the T.O.A.D sculpture in the middle, these are all ponds that people are working on or around. So we do lots of this hands-on work with volunteer groups in helping out these spaces. It's something as well you might have seen us the beginning of last year. We did quite a bit of work across Lambeth on a few of the sort of selected sites that needed a little bit more help. So Myatsfield Park was one of those sites where the pond was in need of quite heavy vegetation removal. And also a small bog garden was made there, and just to make the area a little bit more appealing to the amphibians that also live around that area of Lambeth. So quite a lot of things happening on our volunteering sites. These are some of the habitats that we are restoring. So for any of you that live a bit more sort of, I suppose, in the north of Lambeth, so heading up towards where Guy's and St Thomas's is, this top left photo is Archbishop's Park. So this is work that was done there to improve their pond, which again was just too choked up with vegetation. It's actually quite a nice photo, this, because underneath their sort of mammoth bug hotel here. So obviously we did our job well enough that they were pretty happy to move in there the springtime after we'd finished doing our works. So that's a pond you can go visit that's quite local to you. And also this park here, so this is Myatsfield Park. They did even better, not that it's ever a competition, of course, for the amount of frogs you get in a pond or the amount of frog spawn that gets laid, but this entire mass on this side is all frog spawn. They were very busy in this pond once it was returned to this kind of watery pool as it should be. So it's very much improving those kind of habitats. And this on the right is an example of one of the ponds in Ealing that for sure you'd easily walk past this, which was taken in the morning of our session, and you would never imagine that there's a pond there unless you knew your pond plants. To this, a mere 4 hours later, where all of that typha, which is that sort of reed mace plant that you can see there in the pictures, had all been removed and taken away, and we discovered there is actually water under here. So yeah, lots of that kind of hands-on work that you can get involved in. It's something that if you want to do this kind of work with us, by all means keep an eye on our website, or you can get in touch with me or one of our team to see where we are within London doing work. Events, there'll be a photo here that you guys will be very familiar with, no doubt. So we try our best to do as many sort of talks or public days where we can just invite sort of local families, or even sometimes even school groups, to actually come visit and see the space and learn a little bit more about why it's so important. They're spaces that they do have, and particularly for any children that might be joining us tonight, I imagine your knowledge of our amphibians and their life cycle is probably far better than your parents, who's no doubt forgotten a lot of how the life cycle and things of amphibians work, but lots of that in just tying in what you learn in schools to actually what you live near. So lots of those spaces. So of course over here you'll know this greenhouse. This was from our talk, I believe it was last summer. I might be wrong on that. Kate may have to correct me. But yeah, a little while ago that was really popular. We went out and had a look in the pond, and we did a pond dip where we found a lovely group of smooth newts that were in there swimming. So we try our best to engage as many different people as possible. I spoke a bit about the creative side of our project. So this is for those people that don't necessarily want to go out into green spaces. They don't necessarily want to get covered in mud, head to toe in it, which is a crazy thought, of course. And this is a different way to engage with them. So we've created a T.O.A.D tapestry, which is about 2 meters by 2 meters in size. And it's basically people looking at the life cycle of a toad and what a toad needs to live, or where they live throughout the year. And paired that a little bit with what's important to you in your community. So our sort of T.O.A.D tapestry or mapestry was based in a few different boroughs. So the nearest to yours was in Southwark. So we worked a little bit in, actually I don't think it's there anymore, Elephant and Castle shopping centre. We worked quite a lot in their community rooms, across the borough in cafes and in sort of over 60s retirement homes and places like that to get different people's perspectives. We went into libraries, all different places across London, just to get everyone to have a little go at adding something to this tapestry, because it's as much communities, this tapestry, that it is ours. I think overall it was about 450 people that added something to this tapestry. So I'm very glad that we have someone very creative that works with us that could turn that into something stunning, because my mind doesn't work like that. My mind sees land and goes, we could put a pond there, rather than let's make something really pretty out of all of this material. Going to sort of I suppose the most traditional sense of education, we work within schools, primary schools particularly, and we teach there about our amphibians and reptiles, and basically the threats that they face within the UK. So I think it's a really good way of engaging children for groups like us to come in and actually speak or take the kids outdoors to local parks or ponds and get a real good idea of what they're learning on the curriculum, but in a bit more of a hands-on way. We actually teach, it's a bit of a strange way that we choose to teach about amphibians and reptiles. We teach it in the form of a play. So every child takes on a animal or a character within sort of a group of toads and a few other animals like foxes, badgers, hedgehogs, and how essentially their lives change due to what the human impact is. So that could be as they're trying to move because of developments being made where they live. We talk a little bit about how they move through those spaces and how hard some of those things are to navigate. I've actually worked with a few schools within Lambeth, and it's something we're going to continue coming sort of spring through to summer. It's probably one of our more popular activities that we do. Schools get in touch quite quickly and try and book us up. So if any of you here do work at school and you are interested in this, please do get in bookings early. I hate sending disappointing emails going back saying we don't have time to have every school, but yeah, it's a great fun thing to do, and it's mainly my colleague Becky that runs these, which I always feel bad because I'm in all the photos, but I assure you it's not just me on the London T.O.A.D team. I just seem to be the one that isn't behind the camera in many of these shots. Probably our craziest of all of our activities is swimming with toads. So this is again a different way of learning about amphibians. Of course, amphibians spend lots of the time of the year within the water. So what better way to teach people about them than get them in the water and pretend you are one? So this is where we convert leisure centres into ponds, essentially. It's probably, yeah, if you walked into our office, probably the strangest thing you'd walk into. Giant lily pad floats. We've got snake floats, tadpole floats, frogs, toad floats. We have sort of fake sort of reed bed streamers that go in to create plants and vegetation, and we have frog and toad food. And through this, we're both strengthening sort of children's movement within water, so strengthening their swimming skills, but also they're learning about predator-prey relationships and competition within ponds of food and resources. Yeah, it's probably the most knackering of any of the activities that we do. It's always one of the questions I get quite a lot of, aren't you constantly wet from being in and out of ponds in my waders? No, I stay quite dry in my waders, but this is the activity where I'm most likely to be absolutely soaking from head to toe, even though I'm the member of staff that stays on land. There's a lot of splashing in this activity, but it's a really fun and different way to be able to teach within the water. The other sort of side of our work is wildlife friendly gardening talks. So we do this, and we have been doing this in London now for quite a long time. It's been about 6 or 7 years that we've worked on allotments and community gardens giving these talks. So a lot of it just making people aware of how those amphibians can help you grow all of your lovely veg and your fruit without using any pesticides or anything like that. And also just quite a large encouragement of we should have ponds and places like that, and sort of more wild or messy areas of allotment plots or gardens to allow our wildlife to use those spaces too. it's a really successful element of our project. It's fantastic. It is probably, if I'm allowed to choose a favourite, it probably is my favourite part of our project. I love getting out to essentially, I suppose, be nosy and get to visit all green spaces within London. But it's really rewarding. And the first 60 sites that we did these talks at actually ended up resulting in about 80 ponds being created. And in sort of the past year or two, we've delivered to another sort of 42 allotment sites. And again, we're expecting within a year or so's time to have that kind of improvement of aquatic habitat on site. So it really can make a difference, and it's wonderful to get a chance to go and do that. This is just more images of us going out and giving talks, and this is across all of London. There's plenty of allotment sites or growing spaces for us to go and speak to. We certainly don't need slug pellets if you've got a lovely thriving population of slow worms and toads and frogs on site. T.O.A.D shows, this is something a little bit different. This is whenever we've finished a large pond work, or sort of anything like what you're looking at with Ruskin Park or the one that I showed you in Listeners Abbey. We try our best to come back in the sort of summertime when more people are more likely to come out in their shorts and t-shirts and enjoy the weather in their green space. And we put a whole variety of different stands up, and we just try and show people in a whole variety of ways at once why they should be interested in toads. So we do everything from sort of kids crafts through to this queue here, which you'll be able to see with my cursor, heading into our toad tunnel, is actually where people get a chance to put our virtual reality on and they become a toad, and they learn from a toad's eye perspective what it's like to be an animal that small, and what it's like to try and get back to that pond in springtime when there's so many sort of barriers to overcome. One of the other things that we do is in this bottom right photo. This is something I'm hopeful maybe one or two of you may have spotted. This is Lambeth's toad. So this is a toad that got painted, I think it's 2 months ago now, in Ruskin Park. It basically is facing towards a large pond. And we work with local street artists to basically put their interpretations of toads around London, just again to encourage people that may be more interested in going to see street art than they would be to go and visit ponds. But it pushes the message further in that whilst they're there, they may take time looking at why are we painting toads everywhere. Although to me that sounds like a dream. It's not everyone's first thought of what should we do with that wall. It's a really good way to get people thinking. That print actually, it's quite special because the artist has created a limited edition run of those prints, which we're selling on our website. So if you want to own a bit of Lambeth's toad history, they're for sale at the moment on our website. I've got no idea how well they're doing, but yeah, it's a really interesting and different thing. You can own a little bit of what London toad is if you so wish. I briefly mentioned the virtual reality. This has been something completely different for us to dip into. So we're the first project at Froglife to have any form of sort of tech-based activities, but this is where you put a headset on and for 3 minutes of your life you do become a toad and you see everything their way. And this is something that's been really interesting to do within London, because people often are slightly more short on time. They don't want to stand around and talk to you for a long time, but it is quite nice to get them to stop for 3 minutes to put a headset on, become the animal, the empathy shoots up for the lovely common toad, and then they're more likely to stand around and actually want to learn a little bit more about it. So this has been to about 30 different locations. At the moment it's not out on tour, of course, because of COVID, but if hopefully, fingers crossed, that by next summer we'll get it back out again and get it back out on tour. But it's a fantastic thing to do, and it was quite a hit at New Scientist Live and a variety of other different places that we've taken it. Another really positive thing that happened with this one is we lucked out in getting a contract with National Rail, and they've allowed us to go to every sort of terminal stations, all of their big stations like London Bridge, Waterloo, Liverpool Street, and Holstar Stall, to give people a chance to learn a little bit more about toads, really, which has been fantastic for us, of course, because it's an incredible reach of completely different people that wouldn't necessarily come along to parks or places to learn a little bit more about it. So yeah, it's been a fantastic thing to be able to do, and I'm sure all the commuters would probably agree, along with myself, that I'd rather walk past a 6-foot toad than be chased down by someone trying to sell me The Economist. on my commute or any change at any station. So it's something a little bit different. So you never know, in the future, hopefully next year, you'll start to see us back at stations around London. You'll see our smiley faces standing there talking about toads all day. So as I sort of try and wrap up, because I'm aware you've all done a lot of good listening, just listening to me talk about who Froglife are and what our project is doing. And essentially, I suppose the take homes straight off the back in what you can do. So on our website, we've got a free guide that you can download called Just Add Water. This is a guide that shows you how to build ponds, and we're talking ponds from anything as small as £5, where maybe you've got a bucket you're going to sink into the ground. You're going to add some nice sort of easy steps out to allow any wildlife that falls in a chance to get away, all the way up to sort of larger ponds, sort of 2 meters by 2 meters in your space, and kind of what plants you should be using to plant in there. So it's a really good beginning step. If you've got a little patch of land, by all means add some water to it. The second big action of what you can definitely do is you can sign up to the campaign and help us push sort of our government and our transport departments to create more wildlife tunnels within the UK. The third thing is you can record your amphibian and reptile sightings. This is something that'd be fantastic. The Dragon Finder app is a free app to download on sort of iPhones or any Androids. All it does is whenever you spot any of our animals, you're just going to go on your phone, you're going to say what you've seen. So maybe you've seen two frogs and you've seen them in a park, and you just submit that. That data comes from there with your GPS and just sends it to us and lets us know, hey, 2 frogs are spotted here in February. They're doing quite well. Maybe we've not had records there before. And that to us is so essential, because that's how we plan where sort of limited resources, so things like grants and staff time, that really pinpoints where we should be working. So that's how some of that London toad sort of ponds have come about, in where we knew there were records. So that's something you can do, a nice bit of citizen science. You can do it whenever you wish, when you're out and about, and it'll just ping the GPS to us and where those animals are. It's actually quite cool as well that on our website you can have a look if you'd like to see in the past month or so where the animals are. It's always great in spring, because you'll see toad migration in the UK as all the little dots add up throughout the year. The Cornish common toads move first in the UK, and then eventually, as the days move on, you'll find there's a bit of a sort of a movement all the way up towards Scotland. As it starts to get warmer, as we go north, all the toads start to emerge. It's a fantastic thing to be able to spot. The fourth thing you can do is you can volunteer your time with a Froglife project, whether that be for you guys based in London. You could volunteer with the London Toad Project, doing any of those things we've mentioned. You could volunteer with the New Dementia Project, or even so, without being so sort of direct about Froglife, get involved in your local green spaces. Take anything you may have learned or been inspired by, hopefully, by this talk, and take that to any space that you work within. So there's plenty of good things you can do in green spaces within London. The only other thing for me to mention that I didn't put a little bullet point for here is that if you do ever want advice on anything, so let's say you start building a pond, something happens, maybe you get too much duckweed or something like that within there, do always feel free to get in touch with us. We have an info and advice service, which is info@froglife.org. Please do get in touch, the exact same way that if you spot an animal you're not sure about its identification, don't feel embarrassed to ask. You can get in touch with us through that info service, or in touch with us via social media. We're always here to help. We're just happy to have people that are keen to learn a little bit more about our amphibians and reptiles. So I'm sure that's plenty of you guys listening to me talking away for however long I've been chatting. So yeah, I'll pass over to you guys.
Just before we get started on the question and answers, Emily, I just want to say thank you so much for an incredibly comprehensive presentation, both about sort of UK amphibians, but also I think I speak for all the audience here when I say it's such an impressively sort of diverse range of activities and learning experiences that Froglife provides. There's so much originality and obvious enthusiasm in there. It's really, really impressive and inspiring to see. Yeah, and as you said, hopefully in 2021 it's going to be amazing seeing you guys out kind of on the streets and in stations and in all sorts of places once we move past lockdowns and stuff like that. So really, really impressive. Thank you so much.
No, that's right. Thank you very much for having me as well. Let me stop my
That is
share.
absolutely our pleasure. I mean, I had a load of questions that I was going to ask about people's environments and what they can do, whether people that are lucky enough to have a garden. And then your final slide was so incredibly comprehensive that I don't think I'm going to double up. I just thought before we moved on to sort of the question and answer session from people in the audience, I thought if you wouldn't mind, just ask a couple of questions about you. I'm just quite curious. How does one end up as a project manager for Tales of Amphibian Discovery or Froglife in general? What's the sort of career path that has led you to talking to us right this evening, or perhaps we'll scale it back a little bit and just being so involved in the conservation of UK amphibians?
So I am, as I would like to define myself, an urban ecologist through and through. You will always find me in a city teaching about conservation or animals rather than out there in the countryside. I mean, I grew up in Hackney. We grew up in a high-rise flat. We never had our own garden, and I was very lucky to have a mum that took me out all of the time to local parks and places like that. That's just sort of inspired me to think I just want to do more within this. Went on to study at university. I got to that point, wasn't quite sure what exactly I wanted to do. And then I returned home to London and started working in a small wetland site. Fell in love, actually. You know what, I've got to give a bit of props or thumbs up to the smooth newt. It was the smooth newt that hooked me on amphibians. Their little faces on the site I used to work at, we used to disturb them all of the time, the poor things, as we worked on the site. And then started to work for Froglife on their last citizen science project, which was London Dragon Finder. And since then, Froglife have kept me, which is always great as an employment, something to stay in a job. And then then I wrote London T.O.A.D, this project, and we've been lucky enough to have got the funding and delivering it. So that's kind of, so it's me in a nutshell.
I mean, and I wonder, do you have any advice for, I mean, this is quite a distinctive career path, right? And quite a distinct set of interests and stuff like that. But for people like you that have got, sort of a general interest in urban ecology, do you have any advice for them in sort of steering, at least what they're kind of aiming for in terms of future careers, rather than, not necessarily specific jobs or anything, but just sort of, what to keep in mind?
I think, although it may be a really obvious answer, I think volunteering is great. So do get involved in your local green spaces, even if they are very small sites. I think just getting out there and showing a keenness to get involved is just the perfect place to begin. I mean, you can take that step further, that every so often there are traineeships. So on my project, we've had trainees, and we don't necessarily need formal qualifications. I think it's far more about the passion that you have. If you've volunteered for many years and you've decided, you know what, one of us crazy folk that just love toads, and you've just spent so much time learning about them, then do get in touch. And I always say as well, do be cheeky and ask groups like us or other groups if you want to do work experience, you want to spend a few weeks with us coming out on all of our activities. We always welcome it, as for sure all of us here, as we all sort of grow up and leave sectors like this, the thing I really want is the next group to take it over and continue doing what we're doing, and even better, hopefully. So just stay involved and and be cheeky, ask. There's no harm ever in asking to get involved.
And sort of when you, looking ahead now, sort of if you look back at your career at any point, or sort of what is the big thing that you're hoping to achieve? Like if you could change one thing, or you could achieve one sort of, macro, big sort of top level goal in terms of the conservation of UK wildlife and amphibians, what would that be? Like, what's your big target?
I think personally, probably to safeguard the spaces that we do have. And I think for there to be a bit of a shift, I know it's a massive one, and I suppose this is very much blue sky thinking, but I think there to be a bit of shift at the top level into thinking that not everything is about financial benefit. And although that may sound very naive of me to say, I think there's a slight lacking in the benefits there are to green space. And I think if there's a bit of a shift towards that being the goal, I think everything else will follow suit. As we protect the green spaces, we will in turn protect sort of the habitat for a variety of different species. I think it's very important. I think I mentioned it a few times about children learning on the curriculum. I mean, there's plenty of animals you learn whilst in school that you're never going to see in the wild unless you're going on far-flung holidays. But things like frogs and toads really aren't a textbook animal. They should easily be step outside, visit a local park, go see them. And I think if we can protect that, I think we'll hopefully be moving in the right direction. Yeah.
Good stuff. So I have one more, or like a couple of little sort of mini questions, and hopefully that will lead on to to any questions that our audience currently have. So my main experience in encountering sort of UK amphibians is when I dig them up by accident. I suspect that most people, that the members of the audience that are lucky enough to have a garden, or those that volunteer with us at BPCG, probably have a similar experience. So I just wanted to ask you, just for my own personal knowledge, a couple of things. First of all, can you remind me again of sort of the times of year that I should be especially careful if I'm rooting around in the soil or clearing things? You know, so obviously we're lucky enough at BPCG to have a pond, but I tend to find, it seems like I find toads, and I mean we dug up a little salamander up with some tubers on an adjacent bed, but it's quite a long way away, so they do kind of get around. What are the times of year that we should be especially sort of looking out and being cautious? And if you have that wonderful but slightly unnerving moment where suddenly you've got an amphibian in your hands that you've just dug up, what do we do next? Because yeah, just sort of tossing it into the pond seems like the most logical thing from a cartoon perspective, but there's probably not the right thing to do. So yeah, if you're having that oh no moment and you're holding something slimy and cute, what do you do next?
Yeah, so to answer sort of the first part there about what times of year, for if you're doing pond work specifically, I would avoid pond works throughout spring and the early parts of summer. So this is sort of restoration based things, because ideally we want to leave our amphibians alone to breed at that point. For the rest of the year, sort of an outside of ponds, for the amphibians, I mean, we would generally say up until early November, you're fine to dig around and root around, because from about July to about November time, all of our amphibians are doing one single thing, which is just fattening up. They're just consuming anything that can fit in their mouths. That's the general rule of an amphibian. If they can swallow it, they'll eat it. So yeah, at that time of year, you're fine to do works. From about now, what you're going to be looking at is many of those animals are looking for their place to sort of hibernate or overwinter. So just be cautious at this time of year as you're starting to sort of clear things in spaces. And if you are lucky enough, I suppose, to have them and you are finding them, depending on the amount that you've found. So if it's just sort of one or two frogs or toads, particularly right now, if you're finding them in the soil, just put them to the edge of wherever you're working under quite a nice bit of coverage. So maybe if you've got a log pile, or maybe just a lovely wild messy area with lots of coverage where if you were a predator you wouldn't spot them, you can pop them there, because once you've finished doing whatever you're doing in the soil, no doubt they'll come back and they'll find whatever the perfect place is themselves. I'm trying to think anything else to mention. If it's a large amount of them all in one place, I know newts can be terrible for this. You may lift up one log and there could be 30 of them all lying under there. If it's not absolutely necessary for you to move that, and you can cope with maybe a log being in not so perfect a place, by all means, if you can, leave it for them. But if it has to be moved, then just scoop them up and put them next to another log or so, and they will dig themselves back down a little bit. We're lucky that in the UK, I don't want to disturb any illusions of the curriculum here, but we're lucky that the hibernation per se that our amphibians go through is a little bit different. So they're not completely hibernating in the minute they go to sleep. They'll sleep the entire way around. You will find them get active again as they warm up. So they're okay to be disturbed a little bit to then return to sleeping. So don't at all feel alarmed if you disturb them. Yeah, just move them over out the way, and they'll hide again.
Thanks very much. Right, so now it's over to the audience if you guys do have any questions. There's two ways of doing that. If you look at the bottom of your screen, on the right hand side of your nav bar, you've got a reactions tab. If you'd like to submit a question to Emily, just have a click on one of those just so I can see, and then I'll take you off mute. And then if you'd like to turn on your video, then that's great. And if you would prefer not to read the question out loud, just drop it in the chat function and I will put it to Emily myself. So, and hold on. I can ask you to unmute. I cannot unmute you myself, but yeah, you were in there first. Go for it.
Sorry. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. My question is about hibernation. So it follows on from your last one. My brother always said you had to be really careful if you found flat toads, because they might not be dead, which I always assumed they were. He said they might be hibernating because they kind of go dehydrated, but I didn't know whether he was just taking the mick. So please could you let me know whether this is true and what happens in hibernation?
Yeah, so that sort of flattening or becoming quite skinny tends to be if you found them quite late through sort of hibernation when they're laying there. Although their metabolism does drop the minute they sort of slow down and essentially go to sleep or hibernate, they are still using some energy to keep themselves ticking over. So it might just be that the ones that your brother may have seen or mentioned are just those that are a little on the smaller side. They do tend to fare quite well though across winter, particularly toads. Toads male toads particularly have quite an urge or a yearning to breed. So right now they've consumed huge amounts of food, so that pretty much the minute it gets warm enough for a toad to get out and migrate, the male toads are gone. There's no waiting about it. They're straight off to the ponds waiting for those females. So I wouldn't worry too much about them being looking particularly flat or anything like that, or disturbing them if they are anything like that. It's just likely if they're trying to hide, they're trying to make themselves as inconspicuous as possible. With them sort of flattening, you may also spot that if they get sort of scared or alarmed. So toads' sort of predatory response to stop things from eating them, unlike frogs who quickly run away and jump, they tend to sort of puff or flatten out themselves, and they secrete a toxin across their backs. To us that taste, or to any mammal, it would taste a bit like nail polish remover, our common toads. So it's likely as they flatten out, they're just tasting bad and hoping you're not going to eat them. But of course, us humans, we're not interested in that bit, and we're just moving them on. So it's possible they're doing that. They're just staying still and tasting poor for you. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that at all. And their hibernation, I mean, it is still a hibernation of sorts. There's nothing wrong with using that word. It's just a clarification that if you was to wake them up, they won't die. They will just go back to hibernating again. But it is actually why milder winters can be quite tough on amphibians, that if they're constantly waking up, going out, being active, they're using up some of those energy stores to then try and overwinter again. It's interesting actually, I suppose, on a much wider scale, that whether or not we will start to see differences in some of our species as climate change becomes more prevalent, that if they're not able to overwinter as they should do, whether that will really start to kick out their very seasonal lives. But I suppose time will tell with that one. I hope that, sorry, my very long answer, I hope it got there, good.
Well, I was going to ask about pests and predators.
Yep.
We've got foxes and cats in and around the garden. We do occasionally see frogs, and I have actually seen the cats eating the frogs. So I was just curious about, if you were to put in a pond, would you do anything to make sure that the foxes then just didn't eat everything that all the frogs that were produced? Yeah,
that's a great question. So the best thing when putting in a pond, particularly if you're aware there are lots of local cats or foxes or anything like that, is create quite a lot of coverage around the edge. So we'd advise don't cut the grass down immediately around the edge of the pond. Keep it quite long and sort of wild looking. It's great if you're a messy gardener, just pretty much leave it to get on with itself, just to allow that if anything like a predator's there and looking down, it's just harder for them to be able to spot it. The same for if you've got any sort of log piles or anything you can build immediately close, but if something's startled, it can quickly get away. Foxes, they may eat some frogs, or sometimes even toads. They are the most sort of cunning of any of our species. They're the only ones that we do observe eating toads, because they learn to, if anyone is still eating, sorry for this more horrible thing, but some foxes will learn to flip a toad onto its back, and they'll only eat its stomach because it's the one bit that doesn't have the toxin on. So you may get that, but then it's normally quite obvious if it's a fox that's been consuming them. The frogs have to rely on just a quick jump to be able to get away, so coverage is best for them. Cats are little tigers of the domestic world. They tend not to bother toads too much, again because of the taste. It tends to be if a cat picks a toad up, it's very quick to spit it straight back out and decide we're not interested. Frogs, yeah, it's frogs that do tend to get brought in by cats. And you will find that cats, although quite often they won't eat them, they do tend to play with them. You may find injured frogs from them. If you find that occur, so if it hasn't been eaten but it is injured, just put them again somewhere where it's quite sheltered to allow them time to recover. Sometimes they can recover, so frogs can quite happily get through life with one eye or missing a leg, although that's not ideal. It can occur. The actual consumption in general, I suppose, again, I think the only thing I can say is just try and give them as much opportunity to hide. Yeah, cats will always be cats. Cats come up quite a lot in our work. One of our big nature reserves that we have in Peterborough, we have a lot of trail cams monitoring where our great crested newts and things like that move around, and you can guarantee you'll see amongst all the hours of footage, you'll see cats walk in and out the reserve. They'll walk in looking quite happy, an hour later they'll leave holding a great crested newt. And it's a hard thing to mitigate. The best we can do is, I suppose, give them coverage and hope people keep cats indoors, but I know that can be a bit of a contentious point.
So we have another question from the chat, kind of on similar sort of subject about sort of, making mitigations in your kind of urban environment. A question from Garrett: how can you mitigate? Sorry, let's just scroll down there. How can you mitigate for the presence of fish in a pond? So I'm assuming these are probably fish you put them there yourself, ornamental fish and stuff like that. How can you create sort of a holistic environment that's beneficial to all these species?
Yeah. Generally, fish and wildlife aren't the best together. So you tend not to find amphibians in sort of rivers or lakes where you do tend to find sort of fish. The only of our amphibians that we've sort of spoken about that can tolerate living with fish are the toads. That toad spawn, when they lay it, also tastes like sort of nail polish remover. It still just tastes foul. So fish tend not to eat that. I mean, you'll probably be aware if you have fish in your garden, most things don't get a chance in its larval stage. They just eat. They're great at eating. Nothing wrong with them, but they just eat everything. So it's not the best for having them together. Also, for if you're a keen fish keeper or someone that actually has them as an aquarist, be mindful as well that particularly with toads, they can be a bit of bother for fish populations. But as I mentioned about male toads being quite amorous, if a male toad cannot find a female toad in spring, he will grab on to whatever the next best thing is. And quite often in angling lakes, they will hold on to fish. And you'll find fish middle of summer with S-shaped spines where the toads have held on for a good month waiting to mate, which obviously won't happen. So ideally, not together. You also tend to find frogs and newts. You don't always find them using ponds with fish in. So fish give off sort of an environmental DNA as they sort of shed. And our amphibians are quite sensitive to water in general, and you tend to find if they're aware it's very dominant of something else, so another predator, sometimes they'll avoid it. So an amazing mitigation for that is build another pond very close by that can be your wildlife pond if you're keen on keeping the fish. But yeah, they're tough to live together.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions on that subject, which we will get to in a moment. First of all, question from Natasha. She says, thanks so much, Emily, that was brilliant. Any tips for people with a very small outdoor space who want to create a safe space for frogs or toads? So if it is very small, a small pond will do the job. So you can go into a pound shop or somewhere like that. You can sink a bucket like that into the ground. If you're not allowed to dig down, so I know lots of people in London, like myself, are in the rental market. You're not always allowed to make changes like that. By all means, you can have a pond that's higher than ground level. Just make sure that you've built up a bit around the edge so that things can get in and out easily for them. If ponds are out of the question for any sort of reason, by all means, just create the overwintering spaces. I always think it's tough with amphibians because they spend a short period of time overall in the water. So toads, it's about a month to 6 weeks. Frogs, up to 3 months. Newts, 5 or 6 months of the year actually in the water. But the rest of the time's on land. So if you give them everything else they need, so just plenty of things to eat, invertebrates and things, and by all means having a real solid sort of log pile
sort of messy mud pile, or hibernacular as we call it, which is sort of a capped sort of mulching vegetation pile, is a great way to begin.
Fantastic. So I have one final question from Ellie. Thanks for a fantastic talk, Emily. Really interesting. I have a very small neglected pond in my garden that's full of mud with about an inch of rainwater on the top. I'd like to restore it as I've seen frogs in my garden. Any tips? And is now the right time before spring?
Yes. Restoring the pond right now is a great time to begin. The only time to sort of alter that is sometimes you will get amphibians that will overwinter in ponds, so they may sink down, they may be slightly present in the actual the silt or the mud itself. So if you're coming across loads of them, maybe then hold off, but otherwise it is perfect time to restore it. I think the best thing to do with that is, if you can, sort of bucket it out, leave it around the edge to allow any of the other things that within the pond, all the invertebrates, or the good stuff that you want, essentially to kickstart your life in the pond, allow that to get back in, and move it around the edges. It's also quite useful. Pond sort of silt is normally very nutrient rich. So if you've got anything that loves lots of nutrients in your actual garden, by all means, repurpose it. You don't need to take it away. You can just put it down on top of other sort of soils to help things grow. That's probably the best sort of time right now. It's perfect time to have a look. Only stop if you're spotting animals actually overwintering in there. But otherwise, yeah, perfect time of year for you to get muddy.
Wonderful. This presentation will be up on the BPCG YouTube channel once I've got the footage from Zoom and stuff. I just wondered, before I do that, Emily, could you just would you mind, so I can share it in the chat, the link to on your final slide, you had some information on, which I think would be super duper useful for anyone that does want to create a piece of blue space in space they've got access to. Would you mind just sharing that with me now, and I'll drop it in the chat, and then everyone can kind of copy and paste it.
Yep.
So if you are looking for pond creation tips, you can go straight away off the back of this. Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much.
That's all right. No. That's the link that you're looking for. There's plenty of other info on there on other sort of pages on our website, but that's a real good starting block.
Excellent. One more question from Garrett. Wonderful talk. Thank you. I saw 2 frogs in my small allotment pond this evening. Is that unusual?
Not necessarily. So some still will be out there eating and just consuming lots of things. It has actually been a bit of a weird year for us, that we've had quite a lot of reports where it's still been quite mild. We've had some frogs already croaking, male frogs, so they're already sizing each other up to figure out who's going to mate with the female. And it is far too early for any mating to occur, any breeding to occur in ponds, but they will still be about in those kind of spaces. Actually, quite a good thing to mention that if you're on your allotment sort of plot and you have small ponds, if they're likely to freeze over winter, the best thing you can do is just float something on the top. So if you have a small sort of tennis ball, or if it's quite a big pond, maybe a football, just float that on the top of the water for the winter time, because it will just create one little sort of round pocket of air, so you can still get the oxygen exchange into the pond. So if you've got anything overwintering at the bottom, like amphibians or anything else, they can still have that exchange. It won't suffocate the pond. So it's a really good question to ask at this time of year.
Great. Okay, so one final call to the audience, just to let us know if you have any further questions for Emily. Hi, Ingrid. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. We put a little pond in our garden about 15-20 years ago, and first the frogs moved in, brilliant. Then the toads moved in, and then after a few years the newts moved in. I remember reading at the time that newts eat frog and toad spawn, and we did notice that there was much less spawn around. And they come back, all 3 of them come back every year, which is fantastic, but I still feel that there are many fewer toads and frogs that actually hatch now. Is that true? Is that right, that the newts, I mean, there's nothing we can do about it, we're happy to have all of them, but is it true that newts eat frog and toad spawn?
Yeah, it's perfectly true. They tend not to eat much toad spawn, but they do feast, the male newts will feast on frog spawn. It's actually something that's quite common. So what will happen is, let's say it is your frogs that find the water first, they'll all move in, it'll all be great fun. You'll have loads of croaking frogs, and then when the newts find it, they'll then move in. And because the frogs lay spawn just before newts start to do sort of mating dances, essentially they're just leaving a sort of a free protein buffet on the top of the pond. It's not much work for a male newt to swim up and grab a bite. So you'll find there'll be a bit of an imbalance that'll occur then. So it'll basically, your newt population will boom maybe for a few years, and your other populations, your frog population, will drop off. But then eventually there'll be too much competition for the newts, and then they sort of separate out and basically disappear off to bully their way into other ponds, shall we say. And then you'll find, the frogs will come back, and you'll get this sort of this lovely balance. But yeah, they will be consuming some of it. Frog spawn isn't normally that successful anyway. So if it was the only frogs that you had in there initially with a lack of predators, you might have actually been finding you had a few very strong years of frogs. But it's actually only about 0.14% of frog spawn that makes it to an adult frog. So it's possible you might have had a few wonderful years where nothing was coming in to eat them, and then now you're down to roughly the right kind of level. But yeah, I'm glad you're still of the ilk that it's fine to have them. Normally we have to fight the other way, where people just want the frogs and they don't want the newts, but that they all deserve a spot at a great pond.
Okay, thank you.
That's all right, you're welcome.
Oh, and I live at Lesness Abbey, by the way. So
do you?
We have a conservation group. Yeah, it hasn't been meeting at all since March. So I know that pond quite well. I'd forgotten that Froglife were there, and yeah, I'll have to go and check it out.
Wonderful. Send us through the pictures. I've not been there in a few months.
It was looking good in the spring. I remember it in the spring. Thank you.
That's right, you're welcome.
Okay, so we've got one last question before we finish, just a quick one. So Connie asks, she says, thanks, Emily. We have a small waterfall in our school pond. Will this do the same as a ball over winter? And I think I'm fairly confident saying that, yes, it will function in oxygenating the water pretty well. We left it running last year. Is this a good idea? I guess that there's a secondary question in there, is a waterfall going to mess with amphibians over the winter, or I mean just in general, right? Is it something that, I mean, I have a wonderful image of them just kind of plunging over the side and going back around again and doing it all winter long, but is that the sort of thing that's going to mess with their environment or their habitat at all?
Yeah, so the first thing, you're perfectly right that the waterfall will stop the need of having to float a ball, because the surface water will keep moving, and you won't really get it icing over. Now, sort of filters, water filters, or oxygen, sort of oxygenating pumps or waterfalls. Now, it's a hard one, that, because some are perfectly fine. There's such a range of different waterfalls or all kinds of things that you can build and put into ponds. Generally, they're fine, providing it's not too heavy a flow. So if it's constant movement, you'll find tadpoles sometimes can struggle if it's too much surface movement in springtime within a pond. So even at that point, if you're finding they're struggling to basically stay near the top of the water and bask in the sun to gain their energy, maybe at that point sort of try and reduce the amount of flow. Generally, they're not too bad. It's just, be mindful in how they work. So sometimes they'll have quite large filters at the bottom, so it may suck things out of the pond that you want. Filters you've got to be mindful of course, because you're removing all the small micro sort of bacteria, or all the really, really tiny bits in the pond that you do need for further up the chain. I mean, you don't need them though. That's the other side of that, is you don't necessarily need pumps or anything that will import it within ponds. It's more than fine to have them planted up with a good range of oxygenators. They'll do that job for you. But if it's a small waterfall, it's probably not going to bother them too much.
Okay.
So that was a very on the fence answer there. Of it kind of works. But
answered, yeah. Right, so we're coming up to the end of our 90-minute slot. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we depart. So our next BPCG at Home online talk is 2 weeks from today, on December the 8th, where we will be joined by the author Alice Vincent. She will be talking to us about her book Rootbound, which mixes memoir, botanical history and biography. to examine how bringing a bit of the outside in can help us find our feet in a world that sometimes seems to be spinning a little bit too fast. I think 2020 is definitely a year, an example of that. So yeah, same bat time, same bat channel from 7 p.m. until 8:30 on Tuesday, December the 8th. And I think all that leaves us to do is please use the reaction function or turn your video back on, or use the chat function to really show your appreciation for Emily for a really fascinating evening's entertainment. Thank you so much for such a comprehensive and fascinating talk, Emily. We all really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for
Thank
coming
you.
along and choosing me over Bake Off.
Yeah.